The transformation in Lady Catherine's situation became apparent to Mitchell during his next ceremonial assignment, a reception at St. James's Palace honoring contributors to historical preservation societies. She attended the event despite her ongoing health challenges, accompanied by the same supportive network of colleagues and friends whose renewed attention had been facilitated by Mitchell's discreet intervention weeks earlier. The contrast with her previous public appearances was striking. Rather than sitting in isolation while others avoided acknowledging her presence, Lady Catherine was surrounded by people who engaged her in genuine conversation about shared interests and professional concerns. The royal household staff members who had reconnected with her treated her with the respect and warmth she had always deserved, creating a circle of authentic support that gradually attracted others who had been uncertain about appropriate behavior. Mitchell observed these interactions from his security position with a deep sense of satisfaction that extended beyond personal accomplishment to encompass professional fulfillment. He had discovered that effective protection involved more than preventing physical threats. It required creating environments where the people he served could fulfill their responsibilities with dignity and authentic support from their communities. More significantly, Mitchell noticed that Lady Catherine's renewed social integration was having positive effects that extended beyond her individual situation. Prince Edward, who had initially been the only family member willing to acknowledge her publicly, now found his gesture validated by the broader community response. Other royal family members began to recognize that moral leadership required more than maintaining personal dignity. It demanded willingness to defend principles of fairness and compassion even when doing so involved personal risks. The ripple effects of these changes became apparent during a staff meeting where Colonel Harrison discussed recent improvements in security effectiveness. The Intelligence Division had completed their review of Mitchell's guest screening recommendations and had implemented several modifications that had already proven valuable in identifying potential security risks that traditional methods had missed. The integration of social intelligence into our threat assessment protocols has enhanced our ability to distinguish between legitimate guests and individuals who might pose risks despite appearing to have appropriate credentials, Harrison reported to the assembled security team. This improvement demonstrates the value of field experience and analytical thinking in developing more comprehensive protection strategies. Harrison's comments were professional rather than personal, but Mitchell understood that his superior was acknowledging both the merit of his recommendations and his initiative in developing them. The recognition was particularly meaningful because it suggested that the Royal Protection Unit could accommodate officers who brought creative thinking and moral insight to their professional responsibilities. The validation of Mitchell's security analysis coincided with news that would test his newfound confidence in the compatibility of conscience and duty. Word reached him through official channels that Lady Catherine Pemberton had passed away peacefully in her home, surrounded by the friends and colleagues whose support had made her final months more comfortable and dignified than they might otherwise have been. Mitchell's response to Lady Catherine's death was complex and deeply personal. He felt genuine grief for the loss of someone he had admired and respected, satisfaction that his intervention had contributed to her receiving appropriate support during her final illness, and profound reflection on the lessons her life and death had taught him about service, courage, and moral responsibility. The funeral service for Lady Catherine was held at a historic church in London that she had helped preserve through her charitable work. The attendants included many of the same royal family members and aristocrats who had ostracized her during the scandal, but their presence now reflected genuine respect for her contributions rather than social obligation or political calculation. The transformation in community response that had begun with Prince Edward's gesture of support and been facilitated by Mitchell's discreet intervention had created a legacy that extended beyond Lady Catherine's individual situation. Mitchell attended the service in his official capacity as part of the security detail, but his role allowed him to observe the final validation of Lady Catherine's dignity and worth. The eulogies delivered by former colleagues and friends emphasized her intelligence, integrity, and commitment to preserving Britain's historical heritage for future generations. The speakers acknowledged that she had faced unjust treatment with remarkable grace and had maintained her principles despite significant personal costs. Prince Edward delivered the primary eulogy, using the occasion to reflect on the responsibilities that accompanied privilege and the importance of defending people who faced unfair treatment. His words were carefully chosen to avoid direct criticism of specific individuals, but his message about moral courage and community responsibility was unmistakable to everyone present. Lady Catherine understood that true service requires willingness to defend principles of fairness and dignity, even when doing so involves personal risks, Prince Edward said in his concluding remarks. Her example reminds us that privilege carries obligations not just to ourselves and our immediate circles, but to everyone whose welfare depends on our willingness to act according to our highest values rather than our narrowest interests. The prince's eulogy resonated deeply with Mitchell because it articulated principles he had been struggling to define throughout his own journey from passive obedience to moral leadership. Lady Catherine's example had taught him that authentic service required integration of personal values with professional responsibilities, and that effectiveness in any role depended on willingness to take risks in defense of principles that gave meaning to duty itself. Following the funeral service, Mitchell received an unexpected summons to meet with Inspector Wells, his immediate supervisor in the ceremonial division. Wells had been observing Mitchell's performance since his transfer and had apparently drawn conclusions about his capabilities and potential that went beyond routine evaluation of technical competence. Sergeant Mitchell, Wells began when they met in his office several days after the funeral. Your work over the past year has demonstrated qualities that suggest you might be suited for advancement to supervisory responsibilities. I'm recommending you for consideration for promotion to inspector level, with assignment to our training division where new officers learn the principles and practices that guide royal protection work. The promotion opportunity represented recognition of Mitchell's professional growth and his successful integration of analytical thinking with field experience. More significantly, it offered him the chance to influence how future royal protection officers understood their responsibilities and developed their approach to service. The training assignment would allow him to share lessons he had learned about moral leadership, creative problem-solving, and the integration of personal values with professional excellence. Mitchell accepted the promotion with gratitude and excitement about the opportunities it would provide. His new role would involve developing curriculum for new officers, conducting practical training exercises that tested decision-making under pressure, and mentoring individuals who were beginning their careers in royal protection. The position would allow him to shape the culture of the service by emphasizing that effective protection required more than technical competence. It demanded moral courage, analytical thinking, and willingness to take initiative in defense of the people and principles they served. His first major project as an inspector was developing a training module on threat assessment that incorporated social intelligence alongside traditional security analysis. The module would teach new officers to recognize how social dynamics affected security considerations and provide them with tools for distinguishing between legitimate guests and potential infiltrators who might exploit social credentials to gain unauthorized access. The training material Mitchell developed drew heavily on his experience observing elite social networks, but it also emphasized broader principles about the relationship between moral insight and professional effectiveness. He wanted new officers to understand that their oath of service required them to protect not just the physical safety of royal family members, but also the integrity of the institutions they represented and the values those institutions were supposed to embody. Effective protection, Mitchell explained to his first group of trainees, requires understanding that our responsibility extends beyond preventing immediate threats. We serve people whose influence and example affect millions of other lives. Our ability to help them fulfill their responsibilities with dignity and authenticity contributes to the strength and legitimacy of the institutions we all serve. The training program Mitchell developed proved popular with both new officers and experienced personnel who attended refresher courses. His emphasis on moral leadership and creative thinking attracted individuals who wanted to contribute to meaningful service rather than simply following orders, while his practical approach to integrating values with professional effectiveness provided concrete tools for addressing complex situations. Over the months following his promotion, Mitchell observed changes in the culture of the Royal Protection Unit that reflected broader recognition of the principles he had been advocating. Officers were encouraged to bring analytical thinking and moral insight to their professional responsibilities, and supervisors began to value initiative and creative problem-solving alongside traditional measures of competence and loyalty. The changes were particularly apparent in how the service handled situations involving social dynamics that affected security considerations. Officers were trained to recognize when social bias might compromise threat assessment and were provided with tools for ensuring that security decisions were based on objective analysis rather than personal prejudices or social assumptions. These improvements in professional practices were accompanied by recognition that moral courage was an essential component of effective service. Officers who demonstrated willingness to defend principles of fairness and dignity, even when doing so involved personal risks, were valued for their contributions to institutional integrity rather than criticized for exceeding their authority. Mitchell's journey from passive obedience to moral leadership had taken 3 years and had involved professional risks that could have ended his career. However, his willingness to integrate personal values with professional responsibilities had ultimately enhanced rather than compromised his effectiveness as a Royal Protection Officer. His example demonstrated that authentic service required more than following orders. It demanded creative thinking, moral courage, and willingness to use individual capabilities in defense of principles that gave meaning to duty itself. The legacy of Mitchell's quiet stand extended beyond his individual career to influence the culture of the institution he served. His example had shown other officers that moral leadership could be exercised at any level of an organization by people who were willing to take risks in defense of their convictions. More importantly, his success had demonstrated that institutions could benefit from accommodating individuals who brought conscience and creativity to their professional responsibilities. Years later, when Mitchell reflected on the events that had transformed his understanding of service and leadership, he often returned to the simple moment when he had chosen to offer words of support to Lady Catherine Pemberton outside Ashworth Palace. That brief gesture had required him to choose between institutional expectations and personal convictions, leading to a journey that had taught him valuable lessons about the relationship between moral courage and professional effectiveness. The echo of Mitchell's quiet stand continued to resonate through the Royal Protection Unit long after he had retired from active service. The training programs he had developed continued to emphasize the integration of values with professional excellence, and the officers he had mentored carried forward his example of moral leadership and creative thinking. His influence had demonstrated that individual actions, however small they might seem at the time, could create changes that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Mitchell's story had proven that authentic courage often whispered rather than shouted, and that the most important battles were sometimes fought not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet stands taken at moments when conscience demanded action despite personal costs. His legacy reminded everyone who knew his story that true service required willingness to defend principles of fairness and dignity, even when doing so involved risks that could fundamentally alter the direction of one's life and career. The quiet stand that had begun with a simple expression of human decency had echoed through an institution, changing its culture and demonstrating that moral courage was not just compatible with professional excellence, but essential to its achievement. Mitchell had discovered that the most powerful statements were often made not through words, but through the willingness to stand exactly where conscience directed, regardless of who expected you to step aside. The meeting with Colonel Harrison was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November, when autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Royal Protection Unit headquarters and created an atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the serious conversation Mitchell was about to initiate. He arrived with a comprehensive folder containing his security analysis, supporting documentation, and carefully crafted recommendations that represented months of research and reflection. Colonel Harrison received him with the same professional courtesy he had shown during their previous meeting, but Mitchell detected a note of curiosity in his superior's demeanor. It was unusual for a sergeant to request a formal meeting to discuss policy recommendations, and Harrison clearly wondered what had prompted Mitchell to take such initiative after years of exemplary, but unremarkable service. Sergeant Mitchell, Harrison began after they had settled in his office. Your request indicated that you wanted to discuss potential improvements to our guest screening procedures. I must admit I'm interested to hear what insights your recent ceremonial assignments have provided. Mitchell had rehearsed this presentation numerous times, understanding that his ability to communicate his concerns effectively would determine whether his ideas received serious consideration or whether his initiative would be viewed as overstepping his authority. He began by outlining the security incidents he had identified, focusing on factual analysis rather than criticism of existing procedures. Sir, my analysis of recent unauthorized access incidents suggests that our current screening process may have some vulnerabilities that could be addressed through enhanced understanding of social dynamics within the communities we protect, Mitchell said, opening his folder to reveal charts and documentation that demonstrated thorough professional preparation. Over the next 45 minutes, Mitchell presented his findings with the same attention to detail and analytical rigor that characterized the best military intelligence reports. He described patterns in how unauthorized individuals had gained access to restricted events, identified common elements in the social credentials they had presented, and explained how better understanding of elite social networks could help security personnel distinguish between legitimate guests and potential infiltrators. Harrison listened with growing interest as Mitchell's presentation revealed insights that had escaped the attention of security analysts who focused primarily on traditional threat assessment methods. The suggestion that social intelligence could enhance security effectiveness was novel, but the supporting evidence Mitchell had assembled was compelling and professionally presented. Your analysis is thorough, and your recommendations appear sound, Harrison acknowledged when Mitchell concluded his presentation. I'm curious about what prompted you to undertake this research. Guest screening procedures are typically the responsibility of our intelligence division rather than field operatives. This was the question Mitchell had anticipated and feared. His honest answer would require him to explain how witnessing Lady Catherine's treatment had opened his eyes to the ways that social bias could affect security decisions. He would need to discuss his growing belief that moral concerns and professional effectiveness were interconnected rather than separate issues. Such explanations could easily be interpreted as inappropriate involvement in family politics or as criticism of institutional values. Mitchell chose to answer with careful honesty that emphasized his professional motivations while acknowledging the personal experiences that had shaped his thinking. Sir, my ceremonial assignments have provided opportunities to observe social dynamics that affect security considerations. I noticed that our assumptions about guest reliability sometimes depend more on social connections than on objective assessment of potential risks. I believe we could enhance protection effectiveness by developing more sophisticated understanding of these dynamics. Harrison studied Mitchell's expression carefully, clearly recognizing that this explanation contained unspoken elements that might be significant. Sergeant, your recommendations demonstrate valuable insights and professional initiative. However, I want to ensure that your analysis is based on security considerations rather than personal opinions about social issues that fall outside our area of responsibility. The comment was both a warning and an opportunity. Harrison was indicating that he recognized the potential value of Mitchell's work while reminding him of the boundaries that governed royal protection officers. The question was whether Mitchell could demonstrate that his moral concerns actually enhanced rather than compromised his professional effectiveness. Sir, my primary concern is ensuring that we identify and address all factors that might affect the safety of the people we protect, Mitchell replied. Social dynamics affect security in ways that traditional threat assessment sometimes misses. Understanding these dynamics better could help us distinguish between individuals who belong in secure areas and those who might pose risks despite appearing to have appropriate credentials. Harrison spent several minutes reviewing Mitchell's documentation, asking detailed questions about his methodology and testing the logic of his recommendations. The colonel's military background had taught him to evaluate proposals based on their practical merit rather than the rank or experience level of the person presenting them. Mitchell's analysis met professional standards and addressed genuine security concerns that deserved serious consideration. I'm going to forward your recommendations to our intelligence division for formal review, Harrison said finally. Your analysis raises important points that warrant further investigation. However, I want to be clear that any implementation of these ideas would need to be handled through appropriate channels and with careful attention to political sensitivities. Mitchell left the meeting with a sense of cautious optimism. His recommendations had been received seriously and would be given formal consideration by experts who could evaluate their security implications objectively. He had successfully presented moral concerns as professional insights without compromising his standing or violating institutional protocols. However, Mitchell's sense of accomplishment was short-lived. 3 weeks after his meeting with Harrison, he received word that Lady Catherine Pemberton had been hospitalized following complications from her illness. The news reached him through informal channels within the royal household staff, who maintained networks of personal relationships that transcended official organizational boundaries. The hospitalization had occurred during a particularly difficult period in Lady Catherine's ongoing social exile. Despite Prince Edward's gesture of support at the state opening of Parliament, she continued to face ostracism from people who had once been close friends and colleagues. The combination of serious illness and social isolation had created circumstances that Mitchell found deeply troubling, particularly since he was no longer in a position where he could offer any meaningful support. Mitchell's response to this news surprised him with its intensity. He found himself unable to concentrate on routine duties, preoccupied with thoughts of someone he respected facing serious challenges without adequate support from the community that should have been providing comfort during a difficult time. The situation highlighted the limitations of his current position and the ongoing consequences of his decision to express support for Lady Catherine months earlier. The internal conflict that had been building since his transfer to ceremonial duties reached a crisis point when Mitchell learned that Lady Catherine's hospitalization had occurred on the same day as a charity gala where many of the same people who had been ostracizing her were celebrating their support for medical research. The irony of the situation, people raising money to fight diseases while ignoring someone in their own community who was battling illness, struck him as emblematic of the moral blindness he had observed among Britain's elite. It was during this period of emotional turmoil that Mitchell received an unexpected communication that would test everything he had learned about courage, duty, and moral responsibility. Lady Catherine's niece, who had accompanied her to the state opening of Parliament, contacted Mitchell through mutual acquaintances to inform him that Lady Catherine had specifically asked about his welfare during one of her more lucid moments in the hospital. The message was simple but profoundly moving. Lady Catherine remembered their brief interaction outside Ashworth Palace and wanted Mitchell to know that his gesture of support had meant more to her than he might have realized. She had apparently told her niece that knowing at least one person had witnessed her dignity during that difficult evening had helped sustain her through the subsequent months of isolation and illness. This communication forced Mitchell to confront the full implications of his situation. Someone he respected and admired was facing serious health challenges while dealing with continued social rejection from people whose friendship should have been a source of strength. His earlier gesture of support had made a positive difference in her life, but his current position prevented him from offering any additional assistance during what might be her final illness. The realization that his institutional obligations were preventing him from acting on his fundamental beliefs about human decency created a crisis that Mitchell could no longer ignore. He had spent his entire career accepting that duty sometimes required personal sacrifice, but he had always assumed that such sacrifice served a greater good that justified individual hardship. His current situation forced him to question whether maintaining institutional protocols was actually serving any meaningful purpose when those protocols prevented basic human compassion. Mitchell spent several sleepless nights considering his options. He could continue to follow orders and maintain professional distance while someone he respected suffered unnecessarily. He could risk his career by attempting to offer support that might be interpreted as inappropriate involvement in family politics. Or he could find some way to reconcile his professional responsibilities with his personal convictions, following the example Prince Edward had set by using his position to address injustice while maintaining institutional dignity. The solution that emerged from Mitchell's deliberations was both simple and revolutionary. Rather than seeking permission to support Lady Catherine directly, he would create opportunities for others to do so. His knowledge of security protocols, social networks, and institutional procedures could be used to facilitate appropriate expressions of support from people who were better positioned to help her without creating controversy. Mitchell began by discreetly reaching out to colleagues who had interacted positively with Lady Catherine during her years of royal family involvement. He shared information about her hospitalization with individuals who might be genuinely concerned about her welfare, but who might not have been aware of her situation due to the social silence that surrounded her difficulties. His approach was careful and professional, framing his communications as routine updates about people connected to royal family activities. The response exceeded Mitchell's expectations. Several royal household staff members who had worked with Lady Catherine on various projects expressed genuine concern about her situation and gratitude for being informed about her hospitalization. More significantly, some of these individuals indicated that they had been unaware of the extent of her social isolation and were troubled by the realization that someone who had contributed so much to royal family activities was facing serious challenges without adequate support. Within a week of Mitchell's discreet outreach, Lady Catherine began receiving visits and expressions of support from royal household staff, former colleagues from charitable organizations, and individuals who had worked with her on historical preservation projects. The visitors were people whose professional relationships with Lady Catherine made their concern appropriate, and who could offer support without creating political complications for the royal family. Mitchell observed these developments with satisfaction and relief. He had found a way to address an unjust situation without violating his professional obligations or creating controversy for his superiors. By using his knowledge and connections to facilitate appropriate expressions of support from others, he had demonstrated that moral courage could be exercised within institutional constraints rather than in defiance of them. The success of his intervention reinforced Mitchell's growing belief that effective service required more than simply following orders. It demanded creative thinking about how individual capabilities could be used to address problems that traditional approaches might miss or ignore. His experience with Lady Catherine had taught him that moral leadership could be exercised at any level of an organization by people who were willing to use their position and knowledge to make positive differences in others' lives. However, Mitchell's satisfaction with his successful intervention was tempered by the recognition that he had reached a turning point in his career. He could no longer pretend that his professional responsibilities were separate from his personal values or that effective service could be achieved through passive obedience to orders. His actions regarding Lady Catherine had demonstrated both his capacity for moral leadership and his willingness to take risks to uphold principles that gave meaning to his oath of service. The question that now confronted Mitchell was whether the Royal Protection Service could accommodate an officer who believed that moral courage was an essential component of professional excellence, or whether his evolution as a leader would ultimately require him to seek opportunities for service in environments that valued initiative and ethical thinking as highly as loyalty and discretion. The answer to this question would determine not only the direction of his remaining career, but also the legacy he would leave as an example for other officers who might face similar conflicts between duty and conscience. The state opening of Parliament arrived with the crisp clarity of an October morning that seemed designed for ceremony. Westminster had been transformed into a fortress of tradition, with every entrance monitored, every guest vetted, and every detail of the ancient ritual prepared with modern precision. Mitchell arrived at his staging area before dawn, joining dozens of other security personnel who would create an invisible web of protection around one of Britain's most important constitutional ceremonies. The Palace of Westminster buzzed with controlled activity as technicians tested communication systems. Protocol officers reviewed the precise timing of each ceremonial element, and security teams conducted final sweeps of the historic building. Mitchell's assignment placed him in the Royal Gallery, where members of the House of Lords and distinguished guests would witness the Queen's speech from the throne. His position offered a clear view of the assembled dignitaries while allowing him to monitor access routes and potential security vulnerabilities. As guests began to arrive, Mitchell scanned the familiar faces of Britain's political and social elite. Cabinet ministers exchanged quiet conversations about pending legislation, senior judges discussed recent court decisions, and Members of the aristocracy renewed social connections that had been maintained across generations. The atmosphere combined solemn respect for constitutional tradition with the subtle political maneuvering that characterized all gatherings of powerful people. Lady Catherine Pemberton arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by a younger woman whom Mitchell recognized as her niece. The months since their last encounter had clearly taken a toll on Lady Catherine's health. She moved more slowly than he remembered, and her once vibrant demeanor seemed subdued despite her obvious effort to maintain her characteristic dignity. Her illness was not yet public knowledge, but Mitchell could see its effects in the careful way she navigated the crowded gallery and the grateful manner in which she accepted her niece's assistance. What struck Mitchell immediately was the continuation of the social isolation that had begun during the financial scandal. Despite Lady Catherine's long history of service to charitable causes and her genuine contributions to preserving British historical sites, the assembled nobles and political figures treated her with the same polite distance he had observed at Ashworth Palace. Conversations paused when she approached, resumed after she passed, and seemed deliberately designed to exclude her from the informal networking that made such gatherings valuable for participants. The contrast between Lady Catherine's treatment and that of other attendees who had faced various controversies was particularly stark. Lord Pemberton, whose financial misconduct had created the scandal in the first place, was notably absent, but several other individuals with questionable reputations were warmly welcomed by people who had known them for decades. Mitchell realized he was witnessing the arbitrary nature of social justice among Britain's elite. Forgiveness and ostracism seemed to depend more on personal relationships and political utility than on actual wrongdoing or innocence. As the ceremony commenced and the Queen entered the royal gallery to deliver her speech, Mitchell maintained his vigilant watch while reflecting on the ironies of his situation. He was sworn to protect people whose values and behavior sometimes conflicted sharply with his own sense of fairness and decency. Yet his oath was not conditional on his approval of their character. It was an absolute commitment to their safety regardless of his personal opinions about their worthiness of protection. The Queen's speech outlined the government's legislative agenda for the coming year, touching on issues ranging from economic policy to social services to international relations. Mitchell listened with professional interest, knowing that controversial proposals might generate protest activity that could affect future security planning. But his attention was repeatedly drawn to Lady Catherine, who sat alone in her designated seat, following the ceremony with the same attentive respect she had always shown for royal occasions despite her obvious physical discomfort and social isolation. During a brief recess between ceremonial elements, Mitchell observed an incident that crystallized his internal conflict between duty and conscience. Lord Ashworth, the same individual who had publicly humiliated Lady Catherine at the dinner months earlier, approached her section of the gallery with several companions. Rather than acknowledging her presence or offering the basic courtesy that the occasion demanded, he made a deliberate point of turning his back to her while engaging in animated conversation with others. The gesture was subtle enough to avoid attracting general attention, but pointed enough to ensure that Lady Catherine understood it was intentional. Mitchell watched her reaction with a mixture of admiration and anger. She maintained her composure perfectly, giving no sign that she had noticed the slight, but the slight tightening around her eyes revealed the emotional impact of this continued cruelty. What happened next surprised everyone, including Mitchell himself. Prince Edward, the same royal family member who had acknowledged the protesters at the Remembrance Sunday ceremony, had apparently witnessed Lord Ashworth's behavior. Without creating a scene or drawing undue attention to the situation, the prince made his way across the gallery to Lady Catherine's section and engaged her in quiet conversation about a historical preservation project she had supported. The prince's intervention was masterfully executed. By publicly acknowledging Lady Catherine and treating her with obvious respect, he sent a clear message about appropriate behavior without directly confronting Lord Ashworth or creating embarrassment for other guests. His actions demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that Mitchell believed should characterize people in positions of power and privilege. The conversation between Prince Edward and Lady Catherine lasted several minutes, during which other guests began to notice the royal attention she was receiving. Almost immediately, Mitchell observed a subtle shift in the social dynamics of the gathering. People who had been avoiding Lady Catherine began to glance in her direction with renewed interest, and several individuals who had previously ignored her started to position themselves where they might be included in the conversation with Prince Edward. Mitchell realized he was witnessing a perfect example of how moral courage from someone in authority could influence the behavior of others. Prince Edward's simple act of treating Lady Catherine with dignity and respect had reminded everyone present of standards they knew they should be maintaining but had chosen to ignore for reasons of social convenience or personal prejudice. The ceremony concluded without security incidents, but Mitchell left Westminster with profound questions about his own role and responsibilities. He had watched Prince Edward use his position and influence to defend someone who was being treated unfairly, despite the potential political risks such intervention might create. The prince had found a way to act according to his conscience while fulfilling his official duties, demonstrating that moral courage and professional responsibility were not necessarily incompatible. Over the following weeks, Mitchell found himself thinking frequently about the example Prince Edward had set. The prince had not ignored his constitutional obligations or created unnecessary controversy, but he had also refused to remain silent when witnessing injustice. He had used his unique position to make a positive difference in someone's life while maintaining the dignity and effectiveness of his official role. This reflection led Mitchell to consider whether there might be ways for him to exercise similar moral leadership within the constraints of his own position. As a royal protection officer, he possessed detailed knowledge of security protocols, extensive experience in threat assessment, and relationships with colleagues throughout the protective services. He began to wonder whether these capabilities might enable him to address problems that others were not positioned to recognize or solve. The opportunity to test this possibility arose sooner than expected. During a routine security briefing for an upcoming charity gala, Mitchell learned that several recent security incidents at royal events had involved individuals who had exploited weaknesses in the guest screening process. The incidents had not resulted in actual threats to royal family members, but they had created situations where unauthorized persons had gained access to restricted areas and potentially compromising information about security procedures. The problem, according to the briefing, was that the guest screening process relied heavily on recommendations from established social and political networks. Individuals with appropriate family connections or professional relationships could often obtain invitations without undergoing the thorough background checks that were applied to members of the general public. This created a vulnerability that could be exploited by people with sophisticated understanding of British social hierarchies. Mitchell realized that his years of observing these social networks had given him insights that might help address the security weakness. He understood the subtle ways that social status was communicated and recognized within elite circles, the informal systems through which information about guest worthiness was transmitted, and the assumptions that security personnel made about people who appeared to belong in exclusive settings. More importantly, he had observed how these same systems could be used to ostracize and exclude people for reasons that had nothing to do with actual security concerns. Lady Catherine's experience had demonstrated how social prejudice could override objective assessment of someone's character and reliability, creating situations where trustworthy individuals were treated as threats while potentially dangerous people were welcomed without scrutiny. The realization that social bias might be creating security vulnerabilities prompted Mitchell to develop a proposal that could address both problems simultaneously. He began working on a detailed analysis of recent security incidents, identifying patterns in how unauthorized access had been obtained, and developing recommendations for improving the screening process while ensuring that it remained fair and objective. The project required Mitchell to use skills he had developed throughout his career: analytical thinking, attention to detail, and understanding of complex systems, but in a new way that combined security expertise with social insight. He found the work deeply satisfying because it allowed him to contribute to genuine improvements in royal protection while addressing concerns about fairness and dignity that had troubled him since witnessing Lady Catherine's treatment. As Mitchell prepared his proposal, he understood that presenting it would represent a significant risk to his career. He would be suggesting that current security procedures were inadequate and that social biases were compromising protection effectiveness. Such criticism could be viewed as questioning the competence of his superiors and challenging institutional practices that had been in place for decades. However, Mitchell also understood that remaining silent about security vulnerabilities would be a dereliction of his fundamental duty to protect the royal family. His oath of service required him to identify and address threats regardless of their source or the political sensitivity of discussing them. The question he faced was whether he could present his concerns in a way that would be received as constructive professional input rather than inappropriate criticism of established procedures. The answer came to him as he reflected on Prince Edward's handling of the Lady Catherine situation. The prince had found a way to address an unjust situation without creating confrontation or embarrassment for others. He had used his position and expertise to make a positive difference while maintaining respect for institutional traditions and the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. Mitchell decided to adopt a similar approach in presenting his security analysis. Rather than criticizing existing procedures or highlighting their failures, he would focus on opportunities for improvement and enhancement. Instead of pointing out how social bias had created problems, he would emphasize how better understanding of social dynamics could strengthen security effectiveness. His goal would be to demonstrate that moral concerns and professional excellence were not competing interests but complementary aspects of comprehensive protection. The decision to move forward with his proposal represented a turning point for Mitchell. For the first time in his career, he would be taking initiative to address a systemic problem rather than simply following orders and maintaining the status quo. He was choosing to use his knowledge and experience to advocate for changes that he believed would benefit both the people he protected and the institution he served. As he finalized his analysis and prepared to request a meeting with Colonel Harrison, Mitchell reflected on how his perspective on service had evolved since his interaction with Lady Catherine. He had begun his career believing that duty meant following orders without question and maintaining professional distance from personal concerns about fairness or justice. His experience over the past year had taught him that true service sometimes required taking risks to uphold principles that gave meaning to duty itself. The proposal he was about to present would test whether the Royal Protection Service could accommodate an officer who believed that moral courage and professional excellence were inseparable, or whether the institution required a choice between conscience and career that would force him to make the most difficult decision of his professional life. Mitchell's new assignment at the Royal Ceremonial Division initially seemed like a straightforward rotation to anyone observing from the outside. The division was responsible for security during public events, state ceremonies, and official functions where the royal family interacted with dignitaries, government officials, and carefully screened members of the public. The work required different skills than private residence protection, managing larger crowds, coordinating with multiple security agencies, and maintaining vigilance in unpredictable environments. The division was housed in a converted Victorian building 3 miles from the main royal residences, its red brick facade giving no indication of the sophisticated security operations conducted within its walls. Mitchell's new colleagues were a mixture of experienced guards who had requested public ceremony work and others who, like himself, had been transferred for various administrative reasons that were never explicitly discussed but were generally understood. His immediate supervisor was Inspector David Wells, a 20-year veteran who had built his reputation on flawless execution of large-scale security operations. Wells had overseen protection for state visits, royal weddings, and international summits where a single mistake could create diplomatic incidents or worse. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to anticipate problems before they developed into crises. During Mitchell's first briefing, Wells outlined the unique challenges of public ceremony protection. Unlike private residence security, where threats could be controlled through restricted access and familiar environments, public events required guards to identify potential problems among thousands of people while maintaining the appearance of ceremonial pageantry that the public expected. The art of public ceremony protection, Wells explained during their initial meeting, is creating absolute security that remains completely invisible to everyone except those who might pose a threat. The moment the public becomes aware of our security measures, "We failed in our primary mission of maintaining the dignity and accessibility that makes the monarchy relevant to ordinary citizens." Mitchell's first major assignment was security for the annual Remembrance Sunday ceremony at the Cenotaph in Whitehall. The event drew thousands of veterans, their families, and members of the public who came to honor those who had died in military service. The ceremony required coordination between the Metropolitan Police, military security units, and the Royal Protection Division, with each agency responsible for different aspects of crowd control and threat assessment. The weeks of preparation revealed the extraordinary complexity involved in creating what appeared to be a simple, solemn ceremony. Every participant was thoroughly vetted, from the military units that would march past the memorial to the representatives of veteran organizations who would lay wreaths. Security teams conducted detailed reconnaissance of the surrounding area, identifying potential sniper positions, escape routes, and locations where explosive devices might be concealed. Mitchell was assigned to the inner security perimeter, responsible for monitoring the area immediately surrounding the royal family during the ceremony. His position required him to maintain constant awareness of potential threats while remaining as unobtrusive as possible during moments of national reflection and remembrance. The ceremony itself unfolded with the precision that characterized all major royal events. The Queen, accompanied by senior family members, laid the first wreath before stepping back to observe the parade of veterans and military units. Mitchell watched from his designated position, scanning faces in the crowd, monitoring radio communications from other security teams, and maintaining the heightened alertness that such occasions demanded. It was during this ceremony that Mitchell first encountered the complexity of protecting a family whose members sometimes held conflicting views about their public roles and responsibilities. Prince Edward, one of the younger royals known for his progressive political opinions, had recently made public statements about military spending that had generated controversy among conservative supporters of the monarchy. As the ceremony concluded and the royal family prepared to depart, a small group of protesters managed to breach the outer security perimeter. They were veterans who supported Prince Edward's position on military funding, and they hoped to demonstrate their backing for his controversial statements. Their presence was not threatening, but it created a delicate situation where the security response could easily be interpreted as taking sides in a political debate. Wells, monitoring the situation from the command center, made the decision to allow the protesters to remain as long as they conducted themselves peacefully. His reasoning was that removing veterans from a remembrance ceremony would create far worse publicity than allowing them to express their views respectfully. However, this decision put the security team in the awkward position of protecting the royal family, while simultaneously protecting the right of citizens to express dissenting opinions about their policies. Mitchell observed Prince Edward's reaction to the protesters with interest. Rather than ignoring them or showing displeasure at their presence, the prince made eye contact with several of the veterans and nodded slightly in acknowledgement of their support. It was a subtle gesture that could have been interpreted as simple courtesy or as tacit approval of their political position. The incident concluded without serious problems, but it highlighted the complex relationship between the royal family's public duties and their personal beliefs. Mitchell realized that his new assignment was not simply about identifying and neutralizing threats, but about navigating the political and social tensions that surrounded every public appearance by members of the royal family. Over the following months, Mitchell's assignments took him to events across the United Kingdom and occasionally to international locations where royal family members conducted official visits. He provided security for university graduations where princes served as chancellors, charity galas where royal patronage lent prestige to important causes, and cultural celebrations that showcased Britain's historical traditions to international audiences. Each assignment taught him something new about the challenges facing a monarchy in the modern world. He watched as royal family members struggled to balance their hereditary roles with their personal convictions, their desire for privacy with their public responsibilities, and their commitment to political neutrality with their genuine passion for causes they supported. One assignment that particularly influenced Mitchell's thinking was a visit by Princess into a housing project in East London. The princess was there to open a new community center funded by a combination of government money and private donations, including a significant contribution from the royal family's charitable foundation. The visit was intended to highlight the monarchy's commitment to supporting disadvantaged communities and addressing urban poverty. The security preparations for the visit revealed the stark contrasts that existed within British society. The community centre was located in one of London's most economically challenged neighbourhoods, where unemployment rates exceeded 30%, and many families struggled to afford basic necessities. Yet the visit required the same level of security planning that would be provided for an event in the most affluent areas of the city. Mitchell was struck by the genuine warmth with which Princess Anne was received by the community residents. Unlike the formal interactions he typically observed at official functions, the conversations were spontaneous and heartfelt. Children approached the princess with artwork they had created, elderly residents shared stories of their experiences during World War II, and community leaders discussed their hopes for the neighborhood's future with someone they believed could make a difference. The princess's responses revealed both her genuine commitment to understanding the challenges facing these communities and her frustration with the limitations of her ability to address them directly. During a private moment between public appearances, Mitchell overheard her conversation with a local council member about the bureaucratic obstacles that prevented many effective programs from receiving adequate funding. The irony, Princess Anne said with obvious frustration, is that we can raise money for almost any cause, but we cannot directly influence the policies that would address the root causes of these problems. We can open community centers, but we cannot change the economic conditions that make them necessary. This conversation gave Mitchell insight into the genuine dilemma faced by conscientious members of the royal family. They possessed significant influence and resources, but their constitutional role required them to remain above political controversy, even when they could see clear solutions to social problems. The restriction was particularly challenging for younger royals who had been educated about social justice issues and who felt personally responsible for using their privileges to benefit others. As Mitchell's experience in public ceremony protection expanded, he began to notice patterns in the way different family members approached their public duties. Some embraced the ceremonial aspects of their roles, finding meaning in the traditions and rituals that connected them to centuries of British history. Others seemed more interested in using their positions to promote specific causes, accepting the ceremonial requirements as necessary obligations that enabled them to pursue their real interests. The most compelling figures, in Mitchell's observation, were those who managed to combine both approaches, respecting the historical significance of their roles while finding authentic ways to address contemporary challenges. These individuals understood that the monarchy's continued relevance depended on its ability to evolve while maintaining connection to the values and traditions that gave it legitimacy. It was during this period of expanding perspective that Mitchell received news that would test everything he had learned about duty, loyalty, and moral courage. Lady Catherine Pemberton, whose dignity during her public humiliation had prompted his transfer to the ceremonial division, had been diagnosed with a serious illness. The diagnosis was being kept private, but Mitchell learned about it through colleagues who maintained connections within the royal household staff. The news affected Mitchell more deeply than he had expected. He realized that his brief interaction with Lady Catherine had represented something important to him, a moment when he had chosen to act on his personal values rather than simply following institutional expectations. The knowledge that she was facing a health crisis while dealing with continued social ostracism from people who should have been supporting her reinforced his belief that he had made the right choice in offering his support. However, the news also highlighted the ongoing consequences of his decision. Because of his transfer, Mitchell no longer had any legitimate reason to be in contact with Lady Catherine or to offer any form of support during this difficult time. His expression of human decency had resulted in his separation from the assignment, where such expressions might have continued to make a difference. This realization prompted Mitchell to reflect more deeply on the nature of his service and the principles that should guide his professional decisions. He had spent over 2 decades accepting that his role was to follow orders and maintain professional distance from the people he protected. But his experience with Lady Catherine had demonstrated that such distance could sometimes prevent him from acting in accordance with his fundamental beliefs about how people should be treated. The internal conflict between his professional obligations and his personal values became more pronounced when Mitchell learned that Lady Catherine would be attending the upcoming state opening of Parliament ceremony. Despite her health challenges and continued social difficulties, she was required to attend as a representative of her late husband's family interests in the House of Lords. Mitchell knew that his security assignment for the ceremony would place him in proximity to Lady Catherine for the first time since their conversation outside Ashworth Palace. He also knew that she would likely be experiencing the same kind of subtle ostracism that had characterized her treatment at other recent public events. The question that occupied his thoughts during the weeks leading up to the ceremony was whether he would have the opportunity to offer support again, and whether he would have the courage to do so despite understanding the potential consequences. The state opening of Parliament was one of the most complex security challenges in the royal protection calendar. The ceremony required coordination between multiple security agencies, detailed screening of hundreds of participants, and constant vigilance against threats that could range from individual actors to coordinated terrorist attacks. The stakes were highest for this particular ceremony because recent political tensions had created an atmosphere where any security incident could have far-reaching political implications. As the date of the ceremony approached, Mitchell found himself preparing not just for the security challenges it would present, but for the personal test it might represent. He had learned valuable lessons during his months in the ceremonial division, but he was about to discover whether those lessons would help him find a way to reconcile his professional responsibilities with his personal convictions, or whether they would force him to make choices that could fundamentally alter the direction of his career and his life. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Ashworth Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be another routine day. The brass buttons gleamed against the deep blue fabric, each one polished to mirror perfection during his pre-dawn preparation ritual. At 45 years old, Mitchell had performed this same routine over 8,000 times, yet he still treated each day as if the Queen herself might inspect his appearance at any moment. The palace grounds stretched endlessly before him, manicured lawns giving way to centuries-old oak trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of monarchs, the celebration of victories, and the mourning of defeats. Mitchell knew every stone pathway, every hidden alcove, and every potential security vulnerability within these walls. More importantly, he understood the invisible rules that governed this place, the unwritten codes of conduct that separated those who belonged from those who merely visited. Born in a small mining town in Yorkshire, Mitchell had never imagined he would one day walk these hallowed halls as anything more than a tourist. His father had worked the coal mines for 37 years, coming home each evening with blackened hands and stories of brotherhood forged in darkness. His mother had cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the hill, always entering through service entrances and speaking only when spoken to. The Mitchell family understood their place in the world's hierarchy, and they had raised their son to respect authority, work hard, and never reach beyond his station. The path that led Mitchell from those humble beginnings to his position as a senior member of the Royal Protection Unit had been neither straight nor easy. After completing his mandatory military service with the Yorkshire Regiment, he had applied to join the Metropolitan Police, driven by a desire to serve something greater than himself. His superiors quickly recognized his natural instincts for protection and his ability to remain calm under pressure. These qualities, combined with his military background and impeccable personal conduct, made him an ideal candidate for specialized training. The selection process for the Royal Protection Unit was notoriously rigorous. Out of 237 applicants in Mitchell's year, only 12 were chosen for the final training program. The physical demands were brutal: endless hours of defensive tactics, weapons training, and surveillance techniques. The psychological evaluation was even more challenging, designed to identify individuals who could maintain absolute loyalty while making split-second decisions that might affect national security. But it was the cultural education that truly transformed Mitchell. He learned the proper way to address members of the royal family, the subtle differences between various court protocols, and the art of being simultaneously invisible and vigilantly present. He studied the history of every royal residence, memorized the family trees of distant relatives who might unexpectedly visit, and practiced the delicate balance of showing respect without displaying servility. Mitchell's first assignment had been to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where he spent 3 years learning the rhythms of royal life. He discovered that despite their extraordinary circumstances, the royal family dealt with many of the same challenges as ordinary families: disagreements between siblings, concerns about their children's futures, and the universal desire to be understood and respected for who they were beyond their titles. It was during his time at Balmoral that Mitchell first encountered Lady Catherine Pemberton, a distant cousin of the royal family who had married into one of Britain's oldest noble houses. Lady Catherine was known throughout aristocratic circles for her intelligence, her passionate advocacy for historical preservation, and her complete disregard for social conventions that she found outdated or unjust. She was also one of the few people who ever bothered to learn the names of the guards who protected her family. Their first interaction had been brief, but memorable. Mitchell was stationed outside the library during a family gathering when Lady Catherine approached him with a concerned expression. A young journalist had somehow gained access to the grounds and was attempting to photograph private family moments through a window. Rather than creating a scene that might embarrass her relatives, Lady Catherine had quietly informed Mitchell of the situation and suggested a discreet way to handle it. Mitchell had appreciated both her awareness of the security breach and her thoughtful approach to resolving it without causing unnecessary drama. In the months that followed, their interactions remained professional but warm. Lady Catherine would occasionally ask about his family, remember details from their previous conversations, and treat him as a valued colleague rather than an invisible servant. These positive interactions made what happened 5 years later all the more shocking and painful for Mitchell to witness. Lady Catherine's husband, Lord Pemberton, had been caught in a significant financial scandal involving the misappropriation of funds from a charity he managed. The scandal dominated headlines for weeks, with tabloids speculating about everything from the family's financial stability to their continued place in royal social circles. During this difficult period, Lady Catherine continued to attend required family functions, maintaining her dignity despite the constant scrutiny and whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she entered a room. Mitchell watched as people who had once sought her company now avoided eye contact, as if her presence might somehow contaminate them with scandal by association. The situation came to a head during a formal dinner at Ashworth Palace celebrating the Queen's patronage of a historical society. Lady Catherine arrived alone, her husband having been quietly advised that his attendance might create an awkward situation for other guests. She wore a simple but elegant black dress and carried herself with the same grace she had always displayed, despite the obvious emotional toll the recent weeks had taken on her. Mitchell was assigned to the main dining hall that evening, positioned where he could monitor both the guest entrances and the service corridors. He watched as Lady Catherine was seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, people who had known her for decades but now seemed uncertain how to interact with her. The conversation at her table was polite but strained, lacking the warmth and genuine engagement that had characterized her relationships with these same people just months earlier. As the evening progressed, Mitchell noticed something that troubled him deeply. During the formal receiving line, where guests traditionally greeted the senior royal family members, Lady Catherine was consistently ignored or given only the most perfunctory acknowledgments. People who had once competed for her attention now barely made eye contact. The subtle but unmistakable message was clear. She was no longer welcome in the inner circles of the family she had served loyally for over 20 years. The moment that would change everything occurred during the traditional toast that concluded such gatherings. As glasses were raised in honor of the Queen's continued patronage, Lady Catherine stood with everyone else, her face composed despite the emotional isolation she was clearly experiencing. It was then that Lord Ashworth, a particularly pompous cousin known for his adherence to social hierarchies, made a comment loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. Perhaps some people should consider whether their presence enhances or diminishes such occasions, he said, looking directly at Lady Catherine as he spoke. The comment was deliberately cruel and designed to humiliate her in front of people whose opinions mattered to her. Several guests looked uncomfortable, but no one challenged the remark or came to Lady Catherine's defense. Mitchell felt his jaw tighten as he witnessed this public humiliation. Throughout his career, he had observed countless examples of the best and worst of human nature among the people he was sworn to protect. He had seen genuine kindness and shocking cruelty, often from the same individuals depending on the circumstances and their audience. But something about Lord Ashworth's deliberate attempt to shame a woman who was already suffering struck him as fundamentally wrong. Lady Catherine's response was characteristic of her dignity and strength. She simply raised her glass slightly in acknowledgement of Lord Ashworth's comment, maintained her composure throughout the remainder of the toast, and continued to engage graciously with the few guests who still treated her with basic courtesy. Her refusal to be baited into an emotional response or to flee the gathering demonstrated a kind of courage that Mitchell found deeply admirable. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Mitchell made a decision that would soon test everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and moral courage. He approached Lady Catherine as she waited for her car, intending to offer a simple gesture of support that acknowledged her grace under difficult circumstances. "Lady Catherine," he said quietly, stepping slightly closer than protocol typically allowed, "I wanted you to know that your dignity this evening was noticed and appreciated." She turned to look at him with surprise, not because of his words, but because of his willingness to speak them publicly. In that moment, Mitchell realized he had crossed an invisible line. Royal protection officers were expected to see and hear everything while acknowledging nothing that might be considered private family business. By expressing support for Lady Catherine, he was implicitly criticizing the treatment she had received from other family members. "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell," she replied softly, using his name in a way that reminded him of their years of respectful interaction. "That means more than you might realize." As Lady Catherine's car disappeared into the night, Mitchell stood in the palace courtyard understanding that something fundamental had shifted. He had spent over 2 decades following orders without question, maintaining professional distance from the people he protected, and accepting that his role was to serve rather than to judge. But watching someone he respected being deliberately humiliated had awakened something in him that he couldn't simply push aside. The next morning brought an unexpected summons to the office of Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the Royal Protection Unit. Mitchell reported as ordered, his uniform impeccable and his demeanor professional, but with a growing sense that his brief moment of human compassion the previous evening was about to create significant consequences. Colonel Harrison was a career military man who had transitioned into royal security after distinguished service in the army. He was known for his fairness, but also for his absolute intolerance of anything that might compromise the unit's reputation or effectiveness. He gestured for Mitchell to sit in the chair across from his desk, a gesture that immediately indicated this was not a routine briefing. "Sergeant Mitchell," Harrison began, consulting a file that lay open before him. "Your record of service has been exemplary for 23 years. No disciplinary actions, no security breaches, and consistent positive evaluations from your supervisors. You understand why that makes yesterday evening's incident particularly concerning." Mitchell had expected this conversation, but hearing it characterized as an incident still caught him off guard. He had offered words of support to someone who was being treated poorly. In any other context, such behavior might be considered common decency rather than a breach of protocol. "Sir, I'm not certain I understand what incident you're referring to," Mitchell replied carefully, though they both knew exactly what Harrison meant. "Several guests observed you engaging in personal conversation with Lady Catherine Pemberton following last night's dinner. More specifically, you were observed offering what could be interpreted as commentary on family dynamics that you witnessed during the evening." Harrison's tone was measured but firm. "You understand that such behavior falls outside the scope of your professional responsibilities." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Harrison made it clear that Mitchell's actions had been noticed by people whose opinions mattered. The royal family valued the protection unit's reputation for discretion above almost everything else. Guards who became personally involved in family politics, even with the best of intentions, represented a potential security risk and a violation of the trust that made their access possible. Harrison concluded the meeting by informing Mitchell that he would be transferred to a different assignment, effective immediately. Rather than his usual duties at family gatherings and private residences, he would be assigned to public ceremony security, important work, but with much less access to private family interactions. The transfer was being characterized as a routine rotation rather than a disciplinary action, which meant his record would remain clean and his pension would not be affected. As Mitchell left Harrison's office, he reflected on the choice he had made and the consequences he was now facing. He felt no regret about offering support to Lady Catherine, but he was beginning to understand that his simple act of human decency had revealed a fundamental conflict between his personal values and his professional obligations. The question that would define the next phase of his career was whether he could find a way to reconcile these competing demands or whether he would be forced to choose between his conscience and his livelihood. In the grand halls of power, where tradition weighs heavier than gold and protocol matters more than personal conviction, one man's decision to simply stand still would shake the very foundations of an ancient institution. This is not a story of dramatic rebellion or thunderous speeches. Instead, it's the remarkable true account of how Sergeant James Mitchell, a decorated Royal Guard with 23 years of impeccable service, discovered that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is refusing to move when everyone expects you to step aside. What began as an ordinary Tuesday morning shift at one of Britain's most prestigious royal residences would transform into a moment that challenged centuries of unspoken rules, exposed uncomfortable truths about power and principle, and proved that authentic courage often whispers rather than shouts. This is the story of how one man's quiet stand echoed louder than any order ever could, changing not just his own life, but the very culture of the institution he served. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or words, but with the simple, profound act of standing exactly where your conscience tells you to stand, regardless of who tells you to move.